Albert Lee Seed is proud to support the Back to the Roots podcast. Like you, they value the one-on-one conversations with farmers and other agricultural professionals that you hear on this show. Albert Lee Seed helps organic and transitional farms with a full line of organic and non-GMO farm seed for corn, soybeans, forage and pasture, cover crops, and cereal grains. Check them out at alseed.com. That's alseed.com. Hey everybody, this is Brian. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to let you know that Mike and I are going to be trying some new things with the podcast. Our conversation episodes will continue, and we would like to also start adding some shorter episodes to our feed with the latest news from the organic marketplace, as well as on-farm updates from farmers across the country. So we'd like to ask you all to send any links of news from within the organic world that we may miss. And you can do that by reaching out through our Twitter, Facebook page, or the website. We'd also love to hear any feedback you may have as we make these changes. Also, it doesn't feel right to not address the elephant in the room since the coronavirus scare is currently all-consuming. We hope you all are staying safe during these corona times, and our show can bring a little reprieve from this rapidly changing environment. Take care of you and your loved ones, and hope you enjoy a great conversation we had with Melissa Weyland. You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast, and today myself, Brian Wood, and Mike Klein are sitting down with Melissa Weyland, who is a farmer, a employee of Organic Valley, a regional pool manager, and also what we want to partially talk about today is a consumer of organic products. So that's kind of what we're here to talk about, but Mel, you want to give an introduction of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Brian. I am from East Central Wisconsin. I grew up about 7 miles west of a town called Neenah, which is in the Oshkosh-Appleton area. Although I am a dairy farmer with my dad, I do not consider myself to have grown up very rural. We are outside of quite a populated area. Essentially everything from Green Bay all the way down to Milwaukee connects, and I'm kind of in the middle of that. So I think growing up on a farm, but also having that connection with really more of the city populace, I guess you could say, has helped shape some of my perspective. But as I said, I grew up on an organic dairy farm. We have been certified organic for about 19 years. I do farm with my dad. We milk about 100 cows and run about 1,100 acres, all certified organic. And I really feel like I grew up with organic, and I feel like I'm in this very unique position that I am a second generation organic ear, I guess you could call it. And I hold that pretty close to my heart. I take that pretty seriously. I recognize and I see what so many of our leaders in the organic movement and in the organic farming movement and in the organic food movement, all the accomplishments that they've made and things that they've done through the years. And I think, oh my gosh, what can I do to keep this thing strong and keep it moving forward and for the next generation to come? So in addition to farming with my dad, yes, I'm a pool manager. I work with about 100 members over on the eastern half of Wisconsin. Funny because many of those members I feel like I've grown up with a little bit too. They've, in the farming communities, there are always sales and resources and things that you sort of have going on back and forth. So being a pool manager is just a very natural fit. It's sort of like everybody knows everybody, and it's kind of just like a big family to all of us in our different regions, but in our own unique ways. So in addition to those things, I am part of a startup food cooperative called Oshkosh Food Co-op. We are going to be the very first food co-op located in East Central Wisconsin. The closest co-ops to us are a good 2-hour drive, either north or south of us, to the Milwaukee, Madison, or Stevens Points areas. The reason that I joined that project is that I especially take a lot of interest in accessibility of local and organic food, which is something that in my area we really have fell behind on. We really have not kept up with the accessibility of organic. It's gotten a lot better in the larger chains, but as far as the local food movement, outside of having two very strong farmers markets in our area, we don't have a consistent availability. So that's my primary reason, really my driver behind that, being involved with Oshkosh Food Co-op. That has given me an interesting perspective because we've gone through this process now where I've been a part of having done 2 market studies, which if you ever open a grocery store and you ever go through this process, the things that they find in your market and in your location and the tactics and things that you need to use to meet your local demographics needs are just absolutely fascinating. Some of the things that came out in the market study I would have never expected. So yeah, I'm farming, I'm working for Organic Valley, I'm opening a grocery store. And then I also do serve on the Wisconsin Organic Advisory Council. That's really my first interaction on really a political level with the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture. But I've just sort of come to this realization that to keep this thing going and to keep this thing strong, we need people like me at the table. So I wear many hats.
So what do you do in your spare time?
I try to find time to eat, sleep, and shower in my spare time. No, in my spare time, on all seriousness, this is going to sound really funny, but I am fascinated by consumer trends and what drives people to eat and buy and to make the decisions they do. So I will admit that in my spare time, I probably spend too much of my spare time researching that. Just what is making people tick and the latest trends and the latest thing going on in the food scene. I also, though, Mike, I do love to garden as well. So I like to try to grow as much of my own food and just try to be connected to everything I believe in from a grassroots level in my life and walk my walk.
Mm-hmm. And, the one common denominator there obviously is organic, and there's a passion behind that. Mm-hmm. And before we go into what you've seen in opening the grocery store and consumer trends, I want to hear your transition to organic on the farm and then also like up to today. And you're a millennial, so it's, that's kind of why we're partially interested, speaking from, as am I, but speaking from what a grocer on your personal level or a retailer would be, we're speaking from our own experience. So like transitioning to organic on the farm, was that what drove you to have this passion that you have today?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up, Brian, because there's no doubt that all of the things that I'm doing in the life that I'm living in, really a very purposeful, meaningful life, is because of what I saw growing up and how I was raised in that environment. So my mom and dad actually started farming. They purchased their farm in 1990, and this just came out of the late 1980s farm crisis, which has gone down in history as the worst time that we've ever seen in dairy, and arguably we're in one of those again. But anyway, my dad's dad actually lost the family farm. So the family farm that was the original Weyland family farm, as far as for our strand of Weylands, is actually all developed, and there are $350,000, $400,000 homes in that subdivision. It's very beautiful, but what was known as the original Weyland farm does not exist. So that farm was lost in that time, and so my mom and dad really had to start from literally nothing, from scratch. Back in that time frame, they didn't have a penny to throw at the wall if they wanted one to throw at the wall. But they started from scratch. They started in a rental agreement, really in some poor facilities in a poor farm, and did really the herd first change into it. Milked probably about 30 cows in that time, lived in a trailer house full of rats falling down around them, and had me as a baby. So lucky them. I think what makes my parents especially unique is that my mom and dad are both farmers. You run into different scenarios where one spouse or the other spouse is sort of their farm and the other spouse is along the ride for the ride because they love them. A little bit different in our case is that my mom's just as much of a farmer and even better of a mechanic, arguably. My dad will never listen to this podcast, so I feel like I can say that. But they really were... if they were going to make a farm go right out of the late 1980s farm crisis, when your name is tarnished due to a bankruptcy, they're the ones to do it. And they did. So in 1990, they bought an old farm, just really run down. I mean, the hole in the wall, everything from the house, I can't even believe, that we thought that house was livable now looking back growing up. But if you could picture some of the worst farm houses that you've ever been into, and we all know that they're out there. I grew up in one of those. And I grew up, frankly, really in poverty. My parents didn't have grocery money. I didn't have new clothes. Everything was secondhand, didn't fit, from wherever. And so that was the beginning of my farm memories. The beginning of my farm memories are being very, very poor. My parents working very hard. My dad was trying to farm, and he also had an off-farm job, driving garbage truck. And I remember back then in the beginning days, specifically the problems with animals. So I remember very distinctly things like ringworm and pneumonia and calves dying at all ages. And I remember mastitis issues in the barn. And I remember my parents using the dry cow treatment tubes. I have just all of these weird memories of being very, very little. It burned in my brain of what farming was 30 years ago when I was little. But right away when they had started, my dad was really the driver behind this. He knew that we needed to do something different if this was going to be a go as a family farm. He had seen, again, what his dad and mom had gone through, and he knew it had to be different. And he also knew, he grew up, he had uncles, and really everyone was farming around that time. He had uncles straight up telling him, this is the time of the DDT days, that he had been born just after that. And they would straight up tell him, Dave, you got to get out of here. This stuff's going to kill me. And they'd light up a cigarette, and they'd go with their applicator, and they would be on their way heading down the field, with their haze of DDT and whatever else was being used at the time behind them. And so my dad knew it wasn't good. But he also had fallen upon a little bit, probably about 5 or 10 years into his farming career. He had stumbled across Gary Zimmer and the Midwest BioEg, and specifically the Midwest BioEg Biological Farmer Program. And so he jumped right into that. He really instantly really took interest to and really took to building soil life and building organic matter. Back in that time, we're on pretty heavy clay soils where I'm from. And so we had just a tremendous amount of compaction issues and just all the pieces that come along with compaction. And so just through management and through the proper inputs and really caring for that land before he ever even became organic, he had really shifted that farm's fertility and productivity to the point that he was really kind of rocking and rolling, if you will, before he had actually begun an organic transition, which is amazing. So I grew up being taught, I didn't grow up being taught what organic was. I grew up being taught what biological farming is. And so I was in probably kindergarten or first grade at the time, and my mom was driving me to school one day, and she said, "Do you know what biological farming is? Do you see that sign at the end of the driveway? It says Model Biological Farm on that. If someone asks you, Melissa, do you know what that means?" I'm just a little peanut at the time, and I don't even remember I do remember what I said, because on that old biological farm sign, there was like a picture of a sun, and sort of these like old 90s graphics, but you could see the sun rays. And so I said, "Well, I think it means we farm with the sun." And she says, "Actually, that's right. Yep, we farm with the sun, but we also farm with what nature gives us. So whatever the rain is, and most importantly, we farm with the soil and with the worms in the soil." And they really wanted me to know about worms. So I was never that little girl scared of a worm. I mean, never in my lifetime. The worms were like this blessing, that you'd count your worms and you'd count your blessings at the end of the day. So yeah, I grew up in that biological sense. There was an instance where I was really young, and my parents had been still planting biological at that time. By the way, didn't mean you were not planting treated seeds and things. And so my parents had been planting treated seeds, and someone had spilled some corn seed on the shop floor. And if you remember back then, I actually don't know what color seed treatments are, but they were hot pink, like bright pink, and they looked like candy. And I will never forget the time I was playing in the shop and this corn had been spilled sort of in the back corner behind my dad's pulling tractor at the time. I remember playing with this corn, and I don't know, I didn't understand it at the time, but I will never forget my dad just coming in there and giving me this like full on interview. Like, did you touch this? Did you put it in your mouth? You know, in trying to figure out what had happened with this bright pink corn seed. And again, I couldn't have been, I don't even think I was in school yet. So I don't even think I was quite kindergarten age at that time. And we all know that our farm kids play on the farm. You know, there's always sort of that run of the farm, which can be very dangerous. And I think, when it goes back to all of that, I think it was multifaceted, Brian, where there was this, we know that managing our soils matters and we need to manage differently, but also we're raising a new generation here and we need to be really cognizant and aware if my little girl can't play with the corn seed, what am I doing wrong? And I need to do something different. And so within maybe 15, 20 years of that, here came their transition, and here came that real full-on change to organic from biological. So I think most notably, though, I was 12 when we transitioned to organic, so I remember that vividly like yesterday. Basically, when you're 12, no one thinks you're an adult or treats you like you're an adult, but I don't know about you all, but my brain already thought like an adult. I was sitting in every conversation, in every room with my parents, always listening and learning. And I will never forget that monumental moment that day that Organic Valley milk truck had come and picked us up for the very first time. It was literally like everything changed on our farm from that point forward. Animals, calves were not dying anymore. The ringworm went away. The farm over time was progressively completely rebuilt and remodeled in a sense of that things were sized properly and ventilated properly, and animal care had become that focal point, and the problems just went away. We all talk about this when people say when they go organic, the problems just go away. And if you tell anybody from the commodity system or from the big conventional system, they look at you starry-eyed like you're insane. But that's literally what I saw at 12 years old with my own eyes, that monumental, huge shift just from farming the way we were to then certifying organic. And so along with that had come, I think that as the stress shifted, the family dynamic changed. Childhood was really difficult for me. There was a lot of stress, I think, in my parents' marriage and a lot of stress in the family. But after that point, when they could start making the improvements that they always dreamed of and really building their empire, if you will, it just seemed like everyone was getting along better, and it just seemed like everything was better all around. And then after that came some more of my younger siblings. So there are 4 of us now. And the youngest sister, Jody, who's the most like me, all she knows is organic. So we have to compare notes, and I have to give her a hard time sometimes because all she knows is growing up this like organic, successful farm, pretty nice farm kid. And I'm like, you don't remember the poverty days. You weren't born yet to know what true poverty farming was. But I do. And I remember the schools, we obviously went to public schools just being concerned, are these kids, can you guys afford lunches? I mean, it was really bad back then, and I felt it. It was real. So I guess I take all of that heart and experience with me now into all these other avenues that I'm covering. And it's probably why, Mike, I feel the need to be so busy and just keep working on this and improving this world through farming and food.
Now, when you transitioned to organics, there was probably no organic food anywhere in the area. Mm-hmm. So has the diet of the family, did that change right with the transition to organics, or was that an evolution in itself as far as the food that you ate?
The diet of my family has been really interesting. I think part of it is because we didn't have a lot of money growing up, but it was always a lot of our own meat. And back then you'd butcher them on your own. You didn't have money to take it to a meat market. But we also, for the most part, my parents were gardeners too. So we would try to eat and grow as much as we could. But anything that came from a store, especially when I was younger, frankly, is the cheap junk food that we have coined as cheap junk food now. I mean, you're talking boxed mac and cheese, you're talking the hot dogs, maybe some ramen noodles. It wasn't anything to splurge. I mean, you wouldn't see like those expensive juice color drinks that they have for kids now, or like they were like called Hugs or whatever back then. I remember Hugs. We weren't allowed to have those, but anything from the grocery store was cheap, Mike. So it was really interesting in our family diet. It was like, oh, our homegrown, like the best you could have. And we had chickens. So you had the best food you could have on the homegrown sense, but then you also had this like balance of cheap, whatever we could afford. So the diet of the area, though, you are right that when we transitioned to organic, that was an unheard of. I mean, everybody just thought, oh, wow, you're going to go back to the 1920s with the way you're farming. You're never going to make it. That's really the nature and the culture of my area, of where I'm from, of the Fox Valley. And the food system shifting in general for availability of organic food really hasn't come around until probably the last 5 years. Even 5 years ago, it was still hard to find, an organic cucumber in July, which is really hard to imagine now, because now everything is so much more widely available.
And, one of the things you said was that I think there is, in your parents' mindset, which I grew up not similarly, but with, trying to save as much money on the food that was purchased. And I assume, and we see this a lot on farms, where raising a garden or butchering your own animals, it isn't always the thinking, like I have my own garden as well. And I do it because I love it. And I love to be able to put that food on my table and be able to say, to my family, hey, look at this beef came from a farm that I work with, and these tomatoes are from the garden, and, to be able to say that. But on farms, I think it's more a money-saving thing. Same thing with going to the grocery store, where it's like the cheapest is bought. And I think one of the evolutions that we've seen, and you said in the last 5 years, that's changed in your area, and I've seen it as well, that, what you were talking about, biological farming. Consumers are starting to finally pick up on that as well. That farmer speak, and I think a lot of times marketing companies or food companies that market food think we can't talk farmer speak to the consumer because they won't understand. But it's happening already. I mean, with the availability of information on the internet and being able to go to farmers markets or whatever it is, there's a lot more time and energy invested in understanding where it is our food comes from, and people know what biological farming is. They know what regenerative ag is. They know what sustainable, or they have their own definition of sustainable and local and all these things. That's, I think, what a lot has changed in the last 5 to 10 years. So, like, as far as with the Oshkosh Food Co-op, or what you've seen in the consumer trends, what are some of these areas where people are focusing their attention and education and time to get their knowledge of where their food comes from? What do they value? What's the stuff that they actually care about?
Well, first I want to acknowledge, Brian, that I think this idea of farmer speak not being able to translate to the consumers is right on. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we are no longer in a day where we are talking a foreign language when we're talking about farmers to our consumers, because we are in the day of information. So now, for example, let's just use soils as an example, since it's such a foundation principle of organic farming and what we do. All of the sudden, you have a consumer base that, rather than respecting or trusting a farmer because they grew up on a farm or their parents grew up on a farm, or they had a personal connection and they had an emotional connection to how food was grown, now they're looking at it through a logical lens. They're wanting to know. You hear a lot of the, well, I want to know the science behind that being thrown around. But when they're looking at things through more of a logical lens, they're starting to they're diving into things that we talk about and that we study and we host educational meetings on. So, for example, your consumers now, especially like the organic consumer, they know what soil they know what carbon sequestration is. They're concerned about water infiltration into our soil. They know about organic matter in the soil. They might not be able to sit down with us and read a soils test next to us necessarily, but you better believe you could sit down and walk through a soils test with them. That's just, you have a much more educated, and logically in thinking and questioning generation coming up. Millennials in particular were the largest buying demographic now. Millennials had several life-shaping events that have made us to be really what is sort of this questioning generation. We grew up, 9/11 happened for a lot of us when we were in maybe middle school. Those are formative years when we're teenagers. Divorce rates were at an all-time high when we were younger. If our own parents weren't getting divorced, a lot of our friends' parents were getting divorced. And so, and then if there was the Columbine shooting and just a lot of very unfortunate events that were shocks because they were new to our society. Now it's almost every day you read about some unfortunate event involving a gun or something out in the wild, we'll call it. But back when we were in our formative years, these were unheard of. You never heard of Columbine was in 9/11. I mean, absolutely tragic events. And when we are growing up and we're experiencing that, we think differently. And so anyway, as a result, we don't trust a lot of things, which we'll get into, I think maybe some food packaging conversations in a little bit. But just because I read on a package of food that something, is carbon neutral, I don't believe it. I go and look it up. And that's the nature of our consumer now. We don't trust anything. Part of that's a generational thing, but part of it is the exposure of the mass food system. And you now have consumers who are starting to look at what I call is their moral compass. And so they are instilling their own value system that we really didn't see in previous generations, who were more focused on convenience, right? Or price or cheap or whatever that may be. Now, all of a sudden you have people who are especially privy and especially concerned with things that impact our planet. And so I say, Brian, farmer speak is becoming more and more and more and more translatable to the consumer. What is not being translatable is sort of like our heart and our love and our emotions in it. They're sort of past the emotional part and they just want to get to the facts of, okay, our planet's on fire. What are we doing about it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think with the millennials, you're the first demographic in the technology age, where
that's right.
All of a sudden through your formative years, you didn't have access to all these stories around the world. So those events were huge. And then following on the tail of that was access to all this information.
Spot on.
And it's like, oh my goodness, I can actually with my phone find out that, the whole story behind this package of peas.
That's right.
And it's I think the next generation, Gen Z.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's different because they didn't grow up without access to everything.
That's right.
So, but I think the lack of access to that is what really drove the millennial to start asking questions.
I agree. Mm-hmm. The thing too, Mike, about how, I like your example about how we can just look up a package of peas right now and really find out anything about that package of peas. There is still this reality of we don't really always believe what's on a package because of that. So we realize we have been, millennials especially, when you consider the introduction of the internet, we have been marketed to so heavily, especially we were marketed to as kids. Think about all the cereal mascots and different things that we could all name off 5-6 different cereal mascots that we grew up with and their commercials and their old sayings and colors. But there's this reality, Mike, that we realize, or you have millennials who are like, okay, well, that's what they say, but what does it really mean? There's always a backstory to everything, and there's more underneath the surface of a package. And that is really what your millennials are going for. And that's why you're starting to see changes on the farm level, which maybe we should go over.
Well, I think and I think it'll lead into it a little bit, but you said millennials are questioning, and I think some of that questioning leads to an independent streak. And it's on that package of peas, I agree. I don't believe what's on that packaging, but if I can go find a story or talk to a farmer that has grown that package of peas or for that company, then I have made that personal connection. And it's almost like it's a, I don't know what the right word is, but I found something that's mine.
Yeah.
And then once I make that connection, I'm going to go tell people, hey, look at this package of peas. I know everything about it. You should buy it too. But then on the flip side, there's also if we're with that company, whoever it is that produces that package of peas, all of a sudden we find out something that, this company isn't doing something that they say that they've done, then we're out entirely, and we're going to go tell everybody about it too. Did you hear about XYZ?
Yeah. And do you know, Brian, where you're going to tell about that? It's actually not face to face. You're actually going to tell about it on
online,
the internet,
yep.
and it's actually going to be tenfold versus you telling one person and then they tell two, and then all of a sudden 20 people know. It's thousands of people know because you wrote a review on the internet. And so transparency and exposure is very real right now for food companies or farms or really any business. And you're right on, that falls right in that we're all still more likely to make a negative comment about something that we didn't like versus a praising comment about something we did.
Well, they say good news travels, bad news travels fast. And that's especially true with reviews, I think. I mean, I've never written a review on a product ever that was positive.
Unless you're upset. Yeah.
Yep.
That's your nature, though. Yeah.
I know. But that's just like 3 reviews ever.
Yeah.
Because I don't believe reviews. Like I read a review, and if the first review is 5 stars, just took it out of the box, looks great. That's not a review. But it adds to the star rating, so I think the star rating is jaded. So we could go down a whole rabbit trail about that.
Yeah, and millennials, we can pick on them. We could spend this whole hour talking about millennials specifically. But, Mike, they read those reviews and they are everything. So this is just the shift that you've seen in consumerism.
Yeah. But like you said, getting to that farm level, because I think that's... As far as our listeners, I know there's frustration that because of this transparency, they're required to have regulation, have paperwork, have inspections, certifications, all these things to verify that what they're saying they're doing is actually what they're doing. And they're not always very happy about that. But at the same time, this is why they do it. This is why they have to do it. And as a consumer, what would you say to that farmer that is sitting there saying, well, I don't understand why I have to do all this stuff. Like I'd heard every excuse in the book. I'm just not a paper guy, that kind of thing. But there's a reason behind it, but it's sometimes hard to put that into a line of argument that somebody can actually buy into as a farmer, as a producer of that food, because they don't always see, they're doing it their way, but they don't always get exposure because they're doing the hard work, but we're out there buying the product, but they don't always have that individual level interaction with us.
Well, as a consumer, what would I say to those farmers? That's actually a bit of a hard question to answer, Brian, because unfortunately, I don't even know if this is unfortunate, but consumers, they just really don't care about the auditing or the paperwork part. What they care about is a value. And what they're doing is we're making a buying decision based on something that resonates to us and in our heart. And we know, I'll pick on animals. We'll pick on animal care. Most every person, I would hope everybody, but probably not everybody, when they buy an animal-based product, whether it's dairy or meat, Everybody wants that animal to have lived a great life during their time, right? And that we honored that life when they were here. But I think that as a consumer on the paperwork end, there's just such a disconnect of a supply chain in the middle that is actually dictating a lot of that. I'm going to be honest, Brian, I just don't see the consumer isn't directly dictating our paperwork. That's actually our buyers, that's our retailers, that's the rest of the supply chain. But I think what is important and what the consumer, if you put a consumer and a farmer face to face and they're just having this conversation, I think the consumer will be absolutely mind blown and so thankful for all of the work that farmers do. But that's just not the world we live in. We don't, a consumer doesn't buy a half gallon of milk and then go and ask, the company to send their animal care profile, their animal welfare program paperwork. That's just not a thing. And so what you have is you have a supply chain in the middle of a producer and a consumer who is really just trying to do that work because they're trying to sell to the consumer, if that makes sense. They've identified a value and they're saying, okay, what do we need to do to make sure this happens on our farm so that it is what this consumer values? And so it's a very complex system when you figure we're not, most of us, if you're a dairy farmer, we are in a commodity market. At the end of the day, we're not direct to consumer, and there's a lot of players in the middle that have a lot of say and a lot of push in between. I think in terms of, I'm going to just, because I'm picking on animal care, here's the deal. If you are in the animal products business of whatever that is, dairy, meat, eggs, anything, if you are in that business, you have an animal care program of some kind. There's no question. There's no doubt, that is the new norm. And so as food producers, we need to, I think just accept and realize that is the new norm. Every guy, or woman, dairyman, whether they have 30,000 cows or 30 cows, whatever that zero is behind the number, everyone's on a program, everyone is on an auditing system. And that is largely because one of the top 5 core values of your consumers now is animal care. And so, sort of is what it is. It's interesting now when you have a group that is not, we're several generations removed from farms now, consumers are in general. And so they don't have that connection versus, I think 20 years ago, people would say, oh, I know how a dairy cow is treated, and whatever that sentiment is that they're picking up on, whatever they don't like about dairy now is really new to them because they've never done it. But this stuff's the new norm.
Right. One thing that I find really interesting, what you said, Melissa, is if you remove the supply chain, all this animal care, all the auditing stuff would be completely null and void because the consumer would have the relationship directly with the farmer and could see what's happening on that farm.
That's right.
The supply chain is dictating all this stuff because, like you said, the buyer has to have documentation. So if the consumer asks, well, are you buying milk from companies that have X, Y, Z? So that I guess I never looked at the supply chain as dictating all this until now. It's really interesting.
And the supply chain, as you go through a supply chain, and I'm not a supply chain guru, there's people that have literally degrees in supply chain management and things like that. But when you go through the supply chain, the number one thing for each touch point in your supply chain is also profitability. Each piece of the supply chain needs to make money. And so when you come to the very end and that very tail end of that supply chain, everybody has had a cut all the way through. And essentially, we as consumers, when we hand that dollar over, we're paying for that. And so what is coming, and what especially millennials are beginning to recognize as they've really determined their core values, is that, let's say someone is concerned about carbon footprint. Well, when you start to look through the supply chain, how many times that product or good was loaded on a truck and unloaded, you start to think, oh my goodness, anything I pick up off of a grocery store shelf has one heck of a Bigfoot carbon footprint, you could say, a big, ugly, Bigfoot, hairy footprint. And when you start to break this down, it just only further emphasizes the need to really continue to support and put resources towards regional and local food systems. I think, and I'm a huge advocate for that. That's part of my work with Oshkosh Food Cooperative. I just think we need to continue going this way for the sake of our consumers to realign. They want to buy from us, but we've really got this like mess in between us and them, and this barrier to meet their desires and their values. But you're right. If they could just all see it, they'll make their own choices that way. Mm-hmm.
And, as far as that regional local food system, it's, it sounds great in theory, and I totally agree with it. But the way that the food system is set up currently is the exact opposite.
Absolutely.
It's decentralized. It's large farms in a certain area. Then that product moves where, like you said, through the supply chain, wherever it needs to go. So as you're working with this food co-op on a local level, I mean, you're seeing the people that are actually wanting this regional local food system. Is that the best way that can even happen, is on the local level? Or is there anything, I know this is a huge question, but is there anything on a national scale that can try to drive more of a regional local food system?
Well, I think that is really interesting, because if you look at every major grocery chain right now, they're all trying to look local. There's this very distinct look and feel where you have this very food co-op-y, I'll call it, look and feel, where they're trying to pose as that. And I think, so first of all, I think there's some duping going on, I guess you could say, where it's sort of like tricking the mind a little bit. You can walk into, and I'm not going to say names, but you can walk into a large grocery chain and full on well that literally it could be July and we have cucumbers in season in my region, and there will not be a cucumber that is any closer than 800 miles into that store, right? So I don't know I don't know that there's an in-between, Brian, but I think all we can do is keep trying and keep putting our money where our mouth is and keep supporting local when we can, to continue fostering that system, because you're right, it is all completely busted. I mean, even on a pay level, you look at what a local farmer needs to charge at a farmer's market to just make their balance versus what you would go pay for that same tomato or head of lettuce at the grocery store. And it's just like, oh my goodness. And so we still have ahead of us this challenge of people needing to continue to realize that you do need to pay more for the good in the world, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And on the same token, there are many companies in many areas that are charging more and they're not doing good in the world, right? So there's this very fine line of consciousness that we need to follow, and intentional shopping that needs to happen to continue to help it evolve.
Mm-hmm. And I think the supply chain has taken away, there's a lot of people that don't realize the seasonality of the vegetables. Mm-hmm. Like if you grew up with a garden, you knew when you had, the first thing you have in the spring is asparagus. Okay, you know that, but now I can get asparagus 365 days a year.
Yep.
And before the big supply chains, you ate seasonally.
Yeah.
The root vegetables are in the fall. And that's one thing that I would like to see the younger generation get back to. But it's next to impossible, because I love asparagus. So during the winter, I might buy some asparagus. It's not going to be local. But I would like to see that focus go back to I love restaurants that promote seasonal, in-season vegetables. You're eating what's being grown close at that time. I would love to see more of a change back to that. But this goes back to your comment earlier about convenience.
Yeah.
Because convenience still drives. Look at Amazon. Amazon is worth $1 trillion because of convenience. Mm-hmm. I can buy my stuff while sitting here instead of having to stand in line.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There is a movement happening where more and more gardens are popping up. You're seeing a lot of the school gardens popping up. That movement is really strong here in Wisconsin. There are many different movements to help support those things. So I think that there is actually a bounce back of gardening in general coming. and right now we're really just, as a generation of millennials, sort of going through this barrier of fear. Like people think that growing and raising food is so hard, and they're almost scared to do it to the point that debilitate themselves. But when they just start trying with this plant or that plant, I agree. I think some of that seasonality will come back, but I'm a bit of a foodie, obviously, too. And I love avocados. I love bananas. I love quinoa. I love a lot of things, that don't grow here. So I fall right into that. But when I'm looking at things like, avocados, bananas, coffee, sugars, vanilla beans, where my value system then, comes in is that I know we don't grow that here, and we're growing that in countries that are overall underserved. And there's a lot of issues with social ethics in that standpoint. So frankly, my choice then is I want to make sure I'm buying something fair trade and something that supported a supply chain, because there is going to be a supply chain from those products that foods we can't even grow here. I at least want that to be responsible. And so I think there's a line there where we can try to be better, and really help empower and teach others how to make those decisions too, in a way that aligns with them. Some people don't care about social justice, or they don't care about the environment. They care about, they're buying organic because they don't want the pesticides or herbicides or whatever that may be. And everyone has their different thing that makes them tick. And I think that as farmers, though, that's what we need to recognize and sort of like respect. Everyone, we're all different. We're all, what's that saying that it takes us all to make the world go round, or whatever? That's not the saying. What is it? Takes all kinds. Mm-hmm. I can't remember. But anyway, it takes all kinds to make the world go round. And we as farmers and food producers, we just need to keep that in mind, that our consumers, they're coming to organic already because they have a strong value system and they have a heart for something that we're doing, whether it be environmental or animal care or whatever that may be. And I think that what we have is just a very beautiful mutual relationship, even though there is this supply chain in the middle between the farmer and consumer. So
do you see what the farmer thinks the consumer wants is different than what the consumer wants? Is there a disconnect there?
So I spend a lot of time working with farmers, and I spend a lot of time on the consumer end, and farmers don't have a clue what consumers want, which is a little unfortunate. And not only, I actually spend a lot of my time talking with my farmers about consumer trends, and they're just like mesmerized, but a lot of farmers don't maybe eat and live a lifestyle like I do with quinoa and things like that. But so yeah, Mike, there's a complete disconnect, almost more from farmers to really understand our consumers, versus from the consumer really wanting to understand us. The consumers really put a lot of effort into learning about carbon footprints and all that stuff, that they get it. But we're not trying to understand their side. We think that they're just all a bunch of, big city people and sitting on the internet all day, sitting in an office. And I think we need to be careful.
But I think the same thing is happening to both groups. It's overwhelming to both sides, where the farmer, take the consumer. There's so many different things, like you said, trying to eat seasonally. That can be difficult at times when you got a nice looking, you're craving asparagus and there it sits in front of you. So you purchase it and you feel guilty. But at a certain point, you have to pick one or two of those value systems that you really focus in on, that you're going to try and live by, because to try and do it all, it's overwhelming.
Right.
But the same thing is happening to the farmer. They're seeing all these different trends and value systems that these consumers have, and they can't be all things to every single one of them too. So they eventually throw up their hands as well and say, well, I'm organic. What else do I need to do? Or I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And it's just completely overwhelming to both groups. So, there isn't really an answer there to how you get past that, except to, back to regional and local food systems to have those conversations together, rather than try and communicate it through a supply chain that's who knows where.
Yeah, I think, though, Brian, that there is an opportunity, being organic, also to do a better job of actually explaining what is just right down in the organic rule, because we have a lot of other terms floating around, like regenerative or non-GMO, and you have these pieces that we are not doing a good job as an industry explaining, hey, we are that. We already are doing that. We were the leaders in the good soil movement, for example. And so we're sitting on a big opportunity to just do a better job sharing what we're doing. Also, when you think about one of the number one things, and this is not new news, but number one things that consumers are looking for is transparency and traceability. They want transparency of what is in that package of peas or gallon of milk. Guess what? As organic farmers, you have the most transparent and the most by far traceable good that is on the entire market. We write down everything we do. Everything is clear. We're following a very black and white, clear set of rules that is also publicly available. And so we seem to not do a good job marketing ourselves. And I think it's because organic has marketed itself for 30 years. And now we need to sort of wake up a little bit. I think I call it puberty. It's time to mature and figure out what we're going to become as an adult and where our path is, because right now we're still sitting here with this, sort of like quiet, timid sense about us, and we need to just be very clear. No.
And I think some of that comes back to the millennials and the questioning, and the independent streak, and where organic, I agree that it's marketed itself for a long time. There hasn't been a whole lot of work of, this is what it is we're doing. But right now, as we're maturing, there's big companies that are getting in that are also diluting down that organic, which is where these new labels, these regenerative, these new things are coming from, to try and differentiate organic versus somebody that's doing it, quote unquote, actually organic. And at a certain point, I think millennials, we're saying, or reading these news articles about how there's a 3,000 cow organic dairy, and are like, well, what's the point? I'm spending extra money on organic when it's not being done organically in my mind. And so, throw your hands up again. And, I'm going to save my money and go back and or I'm going to try and find somebody that can do it properly.
Absolutely. You're right on. And, there's this old saying that imitation is the largest form of flattery. And growing up, people thought we were nuts in the organic movement. But here you have big farms, you have big food involved in organic. Now you have basically everyone and their brother planting cover crops and running with that as a marketing tactic. Everything that we've done is being mimicked, and it is very flattering. But I think too, Brian, part of the reason that some of those things are picking up publicity is because people are being caught. And to me, as a consumer, does it bother me that this is happening and that people are getting caught breaking rules? Absolutely. But guess what? It also means that the systems we have in place and the checks and balances we have in place are working, because it is catching fraudulent situations. And frankly, those fines and the repercussions of that are really hefty, extremely hefty. And so I think that over time, I just think that right now, it's this sort of like boom time, and it'll all clean itself back up, because there's a really intricate system and a really big set of checks and balances to protect this thing. And so frankly, I get, there's this like little part of me as a consumer who's like, and no other consumer probably feels this way, but every time I hear of like an organic bust of some sort, I'm like, oh, awesome. Get another one out of here and set an example that this is not okay, and that this is not tolerated in the USDA organic program.
Yeah, I shouldn't feel happy when somebody gets caught like that,
right?
Because I hate the negative publicity that's going to come out of that toward the consumer,
right?
But I love the fact that it's cleaning up the system.
That's right.
Because if there's no repercussions to it, there has to be. People have to be held accountable. You are getting a premium for a product. You're supposedly making a premium product. So I would love I would love to see the USDA do more grazing measures on farms. Like, I'm sorry, but a surprise USDA inspection on grazing on a farm, I welcome that. I think it's great, finally, because in my opinion, when you look at organic dairy, the only thing that's going to save the small organic farm from being swallowed up is the grazing rule. That's the only thing the 20,000 cow dairy cannot do. The 20,000 cow dairy can do everything better, but they can't graze. So that has to be the focus, I think, if we want the small dairy farm to, survive the next 20 years. And when you say
better, efficiently.
Yes.
Efficiency-wise.
Not better. But, I mean, they've got it dialed into a science where the efficiencies on... I had a farmer tell me that his goal is 1.7 million pounds of milk per employee per year. And I look at these 40 cow dairies that are shipping 400,000 pounds a year, and I look at how many people and how much work it takes to make. So it's not an even playing field. So we have to do something different. And I think grazing is going to be it. I think it needs to be enforced.
Yeah, and I think we needed some of the negative publicity around organic that we had to shake us up a little bit. I think that it was overdue. But we're out here in La Crosse at the Moses Organic Farming Conference, and if you go through the program for the conference, there are several different meetings, whether it be roundtables or workshops, surrounding integrity and fraud prevention in organic. And this is my 11th conference. This is the first time I've seen that topic in the book, and I've seen it opened up as a forum for farmers and industry and researchers and USDA to come together to actually talk about that topic and work on it. And so when I see topics like that in the book, that just means there's a tremendous amount of movement towards it. And I think, Mike, we are only going to continue to see more and more spot inspections and things like that. And frankly, as farmers, let's embrace that, because we're not doing anything. Unless you're doing something wrong, you have no reason to not embrace that and be very proud of that. Keep yourself organized, keep yourself on the straight and narrow, right, in terms of the organic rule goes, and don't be irritated when you're picked because you're not doing anything wrong. Be flattered that you're picked because things are being monitored the way that we've asked for them to be monitored.
Mm-hmm. But is a lot of that also driven by the consumer? Like, they want to make sure that there is, behind the organic seal, there is validity to it. Is that consumer driven?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So there is concern for our whole industry. When you look at some of the media headlines that we've seen in the last 3 to 5 years, we have a consumer who is doubting the USDA organic label. There's no question. And I bring this up a lot in different groups that I'm in. How do we restore that faith? I can only go out, and you guys can only go out and talk to so many groups and meet so many people to explain, no, this is real. This is why it's real, right? Until we could do that until we're blue in the face. But what we need now is some headlines about, I think, really sort of bragging about the cleaning up that has happened and the busting that's happened. And we need, frankly, I think we need some media on our side who's going to write things in terms of, this is great, the organic system is working, versus writing things saying, oh, these big farms didn't do this, shame on them, organic is going to crap, that hurts all of us. And so let's just be careful and we need to turn that message, Mike, so it's resonating a bit more and rebuilding some of the faith and trust that we've lost, thanks to one very specific, I can think of one media outlet that continues to put out negative publications, but
that shall remain nameless.
We will, yeah. And it really doesn't matter. We're in a you've got people's attention for mere seconds nowadays. They read a headline and they move on. So,
mm-hmm. Yeah, and look at how many times people just read the headline and don't actually read the crux of the article.
Yep.
And headlines it's clickbait.
Yeah, I have an example of that. Actually, I ran across one from Kellogg. So Kellogg's recently announced that they were going to review and revisit their policy around sourcing palm oil. And palm, for those that aren't familiar, has a whole backstory. You can check into it, but it's linked to deforestation, which is linked to several other things, endangered species and climate change and whatnot. And anyway, Kellogg's puts this article out, and the headline, well, Kellogg's didn't put it out, but the headline says that Kellogg's is revisiting its policy. Then literally right under the headline, it says, Kellogg's is going to work to source traceable palm. That doesn't mean anything for those of you that are in the palm or the supply chain of palm. It's just not pretty. You know, it's sort of like
we checked the
joke.
supply chain and yep, there's deforestation going on. That's funny.
Yep, the white tigers are almost extinct. Yeah, the climate's, we've... Anyway.
Is there any such thing as a sustainable palm oil?
Not to my knowledge. There is one group that is out there. They have like a round table name, forgive me, I'm blanking, they're working on something like that, and they have said that there is no such thing at this time. Palm can be a great thing. It grows really fast. But the problem is it's where it is. It's in areas where it's in countries where there just isn't regulation to protect the environment, to protect people from a social justice standpoint. And so there's literally an entire circle of ugly sort of going on with it. But point being that headline was really quite funny when they come out and they say, oh, we're revisiting policies. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Mm-hmm. And on palm oil, just as an example, organic is not out of the woods on that either.
Absolutely not.
And that's, I think, something that needs to be, companies, if they're going to have integrity and have that traceability and transparency, need to also, you said Kellogg's, and we think large conventional, big food system, but there's peanut butter that's with palm oil that's organic as well.
Yeah, there's plenty of, and I think, Brian, that's where it will hit first, because there are people like me that when they see ingredients like palm oil, they put that right back down. I don't care if it's organic, it has palm oil in it. And so that's where it will hit first. A lot of these things are much more deep rooted, and I think we will continue to see consumers and people pulling together and fighting for causes, and palm is going to be one of them. And at that point, you'll have consumers, but also distributors and retailers really starting to dive into supply chains, and that's where we come in. Palm and palm kernel is used across the dairy industry. It's used across conventional organic. Doesn't make a difference, obviously, for components in butterfat production, right? But there is this, when we're talking about supply chains, these are the unknowns that consumers don't know, that they are a PR nightmare. The last thing that dairy needs right now is more negative PR. And so I fear for those days. Those are the days that I worry about. I don't worry about some of these other things that hit the media. I worry about when really serious social issues hit the realm. It's at the end of the day, we need to do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
I think palm is just a good example that there is still problems in organics and in agriculture that are caused by a supply chain. Not all caused by a supply chain, but there are things hidden that if they do come to light, and in today's society, they will come to light. It's not if, but when, because everybody has access to everything.
Yeah.
So I dread that day, but it's going to come.
Mm-hmm.
Which ties back to the millennial consumer of, if there's a company that can lead the charge and say, no, we are out entirely on, palm or whatever other social issue there is. Well, they've now got a relationship with a millennial consumer that it's going to take a lot to break that bond.
Oh, yeah.
And that's, I think, where you're saying that the organic world can lead the charge on those kinds of things and really be an example and show how it should and can be done.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think what General Mills is doing with their goal of transitioning 1 million acres by 2030, I think that is an example of a company with clout, a large corporation doing something very positive.
That's right.
But that had to be consumer driven.
Yep.
Because they're profit driven.
It was. As was, if you saw the Super Bowl commercial from Anheuser-Busch, which was the Michelob commercial, that's what that was all about. That was an effort to connect. It was like, how many 6-packs to even transition an acre? I mean, it's like, if you do the math, it's an astronomical amount, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that they are connecting with frankly, the millennial consumer who, by the way, they're completely shifting away from beer. Beer is trending out, especially your basic beers. Some people are moving more towards spirits, but mocktails and not drinking at all are actually the trend. And so what Anheuser-Busch is doing at that point is they're trying to share good that a beer company can do for barley farmers and do to make change. And I think it's beautiful. I think that was a phenomenal way to try to engage the millennial consumer and bring them back to beer. That's what they were doing there. So.
So there is really, like, the next generation is trending away from beer and going to, because right now everybody thinks bourbon is cool.
Yeah, fun fact. I actually had this conversation with a farmer last night. The beer companies, Miller is down in Milwaukee, for example, and that's just south of where I'm from. They're talking about some layoffs coming up even in the future. So yeah, beer in general is not, it's definitely on the decline, but you have to realize how local beer has bubbled up and local breweries. And so those are attracting a lot of all generations, not even just millennials. But yeah, in general, you have a generation who is shifting away from drinking alcohol altogether. Yep.
I did not realize that.
Yep.
I thought that's probably one of the safest industries to stay in.
No, in fact, there's this movement that the bar and service industry in particular is working on in their world, and it's what we call the mocktail industry. And so they don't want people to stop coming in, right? And so they want to be able to offer drinks that look like cocktails that are, fun and pretty, and they can still charge whatever they charge for it, with some rosemary in it and maybe like a cranberry on it or whatever in a slice of a fruit. But mocktails are sort of the new trend. In general, I'm not sure really, well, I do know why alcohol is sort of transitioning away, is because you do have this very much more health conscious generation coming up. And that's something that they're just sort of weeding out through that journey of being more healthy.
Throw some CBD or marijuana in there and you got...
That's a whole nother layer of regulation that needs to come, and regulation is always 5-10 years behind. So yeah, we'll see.
How can people follow you on social media?
My way to follow me on social media is Melissa Organic on Instagram. So I just joined the Insta. I'm trying to be true millennial. But that is my public facing avenue where I share different things going on in the industry, and even on my farm, sort of on a personal level too. So yeah, Melissa Organic on Instagram. I think I would just like to close with, we started this podcast talking about how organic, the reason that people had been drawn to organic for the last 30 years is for something in their heart, for something that is in their core value system. And I think that right now in organic, being sort of in this puberty day and age, I think that we have a really bright future if we continue to evolve organic and continue to move it forward and hit on many of these topics we hit on today, whether it be fair pricing to farmers, whether it be animal welfare, whether it be from a social justice standpoint, or many of these other pieces. I think organic just already has such a tremendous, amazing foundation here that is already aligning with people making buying decisions because they care about something. And so I think that my advice to all of us as an industry is let's link arms. Let's keep working on enhancing and increasing and improving and strengthening, and also keeping up with the times with our own logo. And I think the future for all of us, organic farmers and organic consumers, is very bright.
I think that's a great place to leave it. So thanks a lot, Mel, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Back to the Roots podcast, brought to you by Albert Lee C.